Alright guys, Dave Choi here. Welcome to another SyntaxMakers video. And in this video, we are going to focus on this screen right here. So this is the add edit screen for a single job posting. And the difficulty with this screen is that it is actually the same component being used in the display screen. So in other words, this screen will display the job posting to the developer so that they can see what it's about, but in a read-only mode. And then this screen would allow the employer that actually owns the posting to be able to modify the posting or to be able to create a new one. So this component is actually pretty complicated. There's a fair bit going on, so I wanted to dive into some depth as to how I put this together. Alright guys, so as always, all of the source code is available on my GitHub. I'll provide a link in the description. You can check it out. It is fully functional right now. And what I want to do, or how I want to do this, and you can see by the size of this component, which represents the bulk of this screen right here. It's pretty big in size and complexity. So to make this a little bit simpler to digest, I'm going to start with the state, which of course in React drives everything. But before we do that, as always, if you like the video, subscribe. If you would like more help in Rust, check out my Udemy Rust videos, which I will also provide a link. And if you need more help in your own Rust project, I am available. So let's get started. So this is the component that we were looking at, job full view. And I've showed variations of this component, I think a couple of times in some of the prior videos, but it wasn't really fully working at that time. But now it is, including like, just the random, let's see here, So then if I bounce out and I bounce back in, we should see all the edits in there. So how does this screen work? Well, starting from the top of all of the states, one of the things that is required is that the user must be logged in, both as an identification system and because only logged in employees can or employers can actually add new jobs or edit new jobs. So this object is allowing for the check of that state to happen. And then this screen, as you saw before, is landed on by clicking one of these, any of these links, right? So if I click the second one, then we get a different job. So the way that works is I am using React routers. As you can see here, I am using React routers link system. And I am providing as state, when somebody clicks on the link, the individual job post item, as you can see here. So then if we go back to the screen, so this thing is going to come in as soon as this job full view component is rendered out. And here I'm just changing the name so it's more descriptive of what the object is supposed to be. And then over here, I am having a navigate object because I'll show you the details of why I need that later, but it allows me to bounce around within the React router navigation system. And I'll show you that. It's a pretty trivial amount of code, but it's important to make the screen work properly. And then we start to get to kind of the meat of the matter, or at least one of the main pieces. And that would be this piece of state right here, local state. And this is representing the various varieties of subsets of controls on the screen. Now, the reason why we need that is because, as I said, on this screen, this is the employer. He's going into the job that he created previously and he wants to make some changes. So there's a lot of editable controls that are here, right? Including the text editing features. Now, having said that, the developer does not and should not have access to any of those editable features, right? So nevertheless, in order to do code reuse and all of that stuff, I am using the same basic component in order to render out both screens. So then the way that I was initially doing that is I was having in the JSX return, so you can see the form here and then various sub elements, right? I was having the individual controls here, and I was doing something like read only, do this, else do that, right? In terms of JSX. So the read only would have some read only set of elements that only display and don't allow changes. And then the not read only would allow some changes with like drop downs, inputs, stuff like that, right? So when I was doing that, I was doing this effectively an if else in multiple places in the JSX, right? And that's redundant and it'll be slow because obviously JSX is ultimately JavaScript code. So I switched out that mechanism to use this function to generate a bunch of controls into useState that represent the read-only state or the editable state. So in other words, if the read-only state is hit, then every single component relevant to that is being created in one shot, as opposed to continuously checking, are you read-only, rendering one? Are you read-only, rendering another? Are you read-only, rendering another? And so on and so forth. It renders them out, or it creates them out in batch. And then, so that was the read-only. And then you'll see, and these underscores are just because the names overlap, and I just wanted to indicate that these are local to the function. But this section is the else section, or the editable section. So you can see things like drop downs. Higher up, you should see, the save buttons, cancel buttons, and then the checkbox and stuff like that. So then, after that is determined, I return those, and they just simply get inserted into the appropriate position within the JSX in one shot. So this thing is called, actually, let's wait till we get to that piece. Yeah, so that's what this piece of state is, and it is based on this type that you see here at the top, and you can see all of these are JSX elements, right? Okay, so then we have these other types, very long-winded types, right? Stuff like this, and then this function, and all of these switch statements, and some other related stuff. So what is this about? So this screen is doing many things at the same time. So one of the things that indirectly it is doing is it is receiving data, somewhat complicated data. There's roughly 20 or so fields in the job post object, and it is receiving those fields indirectly from the API, which was called earlier. So in other words, this screen made an API call, got a list of individual job posts, and then when I click this link, that individual job post is now represented here, right? So there's this data model sort of feature in this screen, right? On top of that, you have, like I said, because it's a shared component across read-only and writable modes, that there is data that is only going to be relevant to the writable mode, and there's data that's only going to be relevant to the read-only mode, and some complementary data as well, right? So this is a lot of data. So what I decided is that instead of having 20 different use state calls for each of these individual fields, and we'll go over these types because, obviously this is TypeScript, so we'll go over that. But instead of doing that, and instead of having, say, a single large singleton object inside of a use state and then modifying individually the fields in there, I wanted to go with something that is more structured. So therefore, I'm using the use reducer hook. Now, just to be clear, if you're not familiar with Redux, this is not a part of Redux. This is part of standard React. But basically, it functions in a highly similar way to Redux, in the sense that in Redux, you have a global singleton state, and then there are sort of these fields within that state object that represent different aspects of the global state data. So you can kind of mimic a similar style, but nevertheless local to your component by using the use reducer hook. So the syntax of the API is very similar to use state. So you have a setter and then you have the getter, right? And then because this is TypeScript, again, I am sending over type specific information. And then I have this little function that acts as the logic. How is this state, that is these individual pieces of state, how are they going to be modified? In what method are they going to be modified, right? So this over here is just an initializer. That's why it's so long. But really the heart of it is this guy right here. So then if we start with the type definitions, right? So we're back up on top. We have the state within the component that, although it's highly similar to the job post, nevertheless, I did want to make it distinct because, as I said, the job post is ultimately coming from the API, and this state is ultimately part of the component. So I wanted to make those two things be distinct from each other, right? Separation of concerns. So we have this form state, and it has these various fields. Things like employee name would, of course, show up on the read-only mode of the screen. And then employer ID would show up in the editable, actually not employer ID, but one of these others like primary lang ID, because that is what is going to select, the appropriate desired language, primary language, and so on and so forth. So we have the type of the data in the reducer, and then we have the form action itself, which is the way that we distinguish, well, a request came in to change some aspect of the form data, the form state, right? But which one do you want to change, right? Which piece of the data do you want to change? So this form action is going to indicate that with this type field and these enums, right? So I want to change the ID. I want to change the updated at, the employer ID, the employer name, whatever, etc. And then this is the data that I want to change it with. And since all of these are, it's possible that some of them are numbers or strings or whatever, I made this of type any. Okay, so then the other thing is the main driver of this is the reducer itself. So the reducer itself is going to take the current state and then it's going to take the desired action on it, right? What type of state change do you want? And then it's going to create a new piece of state because we're not allowed to mutate the existing state. So we're going to create a brand new piece of state, and we're going to modify that, and we're going to return that as part of the return of the reducer right here. So this is pretty obvious what's going on. We have a switch statement. We find out, well, what type of action are you? And if you're an ID, then the modified field would be ID, and the payload is given to that field specifically. Whereas if you were updated at, then the updated at would need to be changed, and so on and so forth. So then we have the type that I'm using to indicate the action type and the state type right here. And that's it. And this is what is used for the bulk of the state, the main state, the data model state within the component itself for display. Again, UI state, right, from the data model. And then what we have here is something that is specific to my particular case. Nevertheless, this sort of, how should I say, uncomfortable type of data relationship may ultimately exist in your apps in one form or another. So what this guy is supposed to be is, as you can see by the name, it's the last country ID or the last selected country ID or the last set country ID. And the reason why I need that is because in my app, I am allowing the ability for the employer to indicate whether the job is remote only or specific to a particular country. And eventually I'm going to add, state, city, and all that stuff. But for now, we have only the country, and the only country is United States. So this little thing right here, this little piece of capability, actually adds a fair amount of complexity to the app because of the fact that the API, once I submit, is expecting a certain very specific schema of data to come in as input. And what that means is if I select not remote, right, then that means United States or whatever country has to be populated. So country ID has to come into the API as a populated field. But if I do remote true, then that field should not be populated because it doesn't make sense to be both remote and working at a particular country, because right now I'm not enabling hybrid modes. So in order to make that possible without causing the API to reject my call, I always maintain a prior state of the selected or set country. So that last country could have been, coming in from here, meaning coming in from the React Router state object, right, and just set right here. But then since the user can change that, save it, and then change their mind, come back, save it again, right? Everything still has to work and still has to be filled out as appropriate. So this guy is going to maintain that prior setting just in case the user changes their mind once again, and populate or repopulate as necessary. And I'll show you the code for that in a bit as well. So then, kind of on the same thread, as I said, the needs, or as I implied, the needs of the UI are not the same as the needs of the API. So the API has its own schema expectation coming in from whatever the client is, because obviously we could have different types of clients. We could have an iOS Swift app or whatever making these calls. So the UI and the API have different requirements. So one of the things that I wanted to do to make sure that the API got the specific parameters that it needed and not some other weird thing, because this object, although perfectly matching the component UI needs, is actually more fields than needed by the API when updating the job posting. So this job form state object is representing the API schema requirement of the parameter that it's supposed to take. So here I just initialized the default values, but you'll see in a moment in the submit call that all of these values get filled and none of the other values, like for example country name, get put into here. And so the API will validate and accept the call. All right, so then this thing is because, as you saw, we have this component being used in two screens. So I need to indicate what type of user I am. This will trigger appropriately upon login. So I'll know, are you a dev or are you an employer? And then I also wanted to disable the button when either validation fails or the submission is ongoing. So that's what this piece of state is about. All right, so now we start getting into some of the logic. And basically what we have here is, you saw earlier, we have the route job post that is the state coming in from the URL click in React Router. So this use effect is running when this changes, or if this changes, and then it's trying to see if there is some data in here, and then it's setting it to the reducer state. Now, the reason why I have this dedicated function instead of just directly calling set current job post, the reducer setter, is because, as you can see here, there's just a ton of different calls that need to be made, at least during the initialization phase from React Router. So putting that into a single function and having it all together just made sense. So in here, we are taking that route job post, we're casting it to a job post because it does come in as any, and then we're setting it to the reducer. Now, for those of you who hate the use effect or find it confusing, honestly, there's nothing confusing about this utility. This is called use effect because this is the cause. It's a cause, and this is the effect, right? This is the cause, the changing of what's in here. You could have other stuff, blah, blah, blah. But that's all that this is. I see a lot of stuff on the internet about use effect. It sucks and it doesn't work and whatever. And I really don't understand what they're talking about. Cause, effect. Done. All right. So the next use effect is what happens after I set the reducer. So this coincidentally happens to have the same name as the reducer, but ignore that. This is the reducer. I should probably underscore this as well, but anyway, so cause, what is going to be the effect? Well, as I mentioned before, when read-only is writable or not read-only, or it is read-only, I want different stuff to appear on the screen. So I'm using this function to make that happen. Well, I'm using this function to create those components, and then I'm using this setter to set that state of multiple components that you saw up here, right? So that was part of this stuff. So in here, we're doing that, and we're doing it appropriately. So write mode, we're doing all the drop downs, the inputs, etc. Read-only mode, we're doing like divs and spans and non-editable type stuff. So that's what's happening here. And then I already showed you this function. It's setting the reducer or all of the fields of the reducer, because this is an initialization type function in a single function. So all of that is happening there. And then I already explained this. We have all of our individual components in a single place that gets set up as appropriate. And then over here, we have navigate. So in React Router, you have various utility hooks that allow you to do, typical URL navigation type stuff. And this is a major one. So by putting in -1, I'm just saying go back. And what this is tied to is the cancel button. Whoops. All right, that's a lot of fun. So that's another bug I gotta fix. But anyway, so this is the navigate back button. And then after that, you have this, which is responsible for that, this stuff, right? So how does that work? So the way that works is, so initially, what I want to do is I want to trigger a toggling of that is remote yes or no checkbox button, right? So that's the first thing that I want to do. And then I want to set, the disablement of the submit button as appropriate. Now, after I do that, what is then the state of that button? Is it true that it is remote, or is it false that it's not remote? Well, if it is remote, then I do not want to set the country ID for the reasons that I just mentioned before. But if it is remote, then I do want to set the country ID, and I saved that last country ID into the last country ID state object. So that's what's happening here. Now the rest of these are pretty straightforward, so I won't dive too deeply into them. This clearly, if you're typing in the text box for the title, then it's going to update the state linked to that text box, as well as do whatever is appropriate for the submit button. In this case, disabled is false because you changed something, so obviously I want to let you save if that's what you intended. And then change country and all the other relevant fields that are there. All right, so this is the submitter. And if you click the on-click submit button, so you have this save button right here, again, within that function that creates all of the editable or non-editable components. So what are we doing here? So the first thing that I want to do is not do a post submit off of the form. So we're going to let React do that. And then I'm going to disable the button before I get started. Then I'm going to set the form values. And that is those API specific fields that I mentioned earlier. And notice that this is a use ref. It's a ref type, as you can see here. And the reason for that, again, is because this data is specific to making an API call and not specific to anything to do with updating or refreshing the UI. So I do not want to make changes of this state to trigger UI refreshes. So be cognizant of that. And then, so that's that. And then, again, I check that you are logged in, you have authenticated properly. And then if you haven't, then I throw an exception because that is an exceptional situation. And then we have our repository call, update job post. I think I probably showed you guys this call before, but we have our job form state object as I've built out right here. It's in this file, again, because it's part of the repository. Yeah. So then we make the fetch call to the appropriate URL. We include credentials because we have to. I don't want any caching just in case. And then there's my bearer token. And here is a stringified version of that state, form state. And then whatever returns as appropriate to the API. After that, what I realized I had to do is I realized that I needed to refresh the URL state object coming in from React Router. And the reason for that is because if I'm in this screen and obviously it has certain field values that came in from the database, right? So when I click this button, those stale database values are what is populated not only onto the screen, but onto the state object that is being passed into this component. Okay, now that's fine, but if I change this, right, and I save it, that state object is no longer valid for obvious reasons because I just changed this thing, right? You can see right here. So either the user would have to know that, bounce back here, bounce back to this screen, and then bounce back in, which is clearly not doable, or I would need to refresh that for them, which is what I did right here. So then, because again, we're talking about the job post object, not the form state object, right? So we have a lot more fields and we have all the name related fields in there, right? So I have to refresh that. And then once I refresh that, what I have to do is on the current URL, which is this URL right here, because we're talking about this screen. On the current URL, I have to pass that state object back in and replace the existing one. And then we have the state for the disablement for the button. What is this? This is a function, a convenience function to when the user modifies anything in here to have the text editor component pass that back to me. Pass that back to me because I need it to be part of the job post object so that I can add it to the form values that are submitted to the API, right? Because the text editor is a distinct component separate from this component. So it rules over that value, and therefore, in order for this parent component to be able to access that, we would need a function to send it back. All right, so that's that. And then you have the form values, and then we have our JSX, again, a form, although I'm not using the action capabilities in the form, but we see our display components custom to the mode that the screen is in. And then, yeah, that's pretty much it. This thing is painful to construct. It's not intuitive. It would take a long time to go over in this video, so I'm not going to do it. The source code is available. It is working, as you saw. So if you need Slate.js functionality, take a look at that. It's fairly hard to figure it out from the docs. So feel free to leave a question if you have any issues. So that is the status update number 5 for SyntaxMakers. And thanks for watching the video.